We're learning the book by Rabbi Breslau, which is Cherev Nakem Bris, the book that avenges Eila Divrei Bris, which is a book by the Hamburg Bezdin that was written against the original book of the Reformers, or Noga. There's a few more books back and forth, all written basically in the same year in 1820, 1819, 1820. And so the first half of the book, basically, he was very sort of polemical, very flowery, really kind of read like Musar to the Hamburg Bezdin, which he obviously saw as, either he saw or he was depicting them as the sinners. And the question of whether his book is written in a form of satire, or is it just that he's, so passionate, or is it that he's trying to use their methodology against them? Those are all, I think, interesting questions. Certainly, there's a long article that tries to make the case that it's written, it's polemical, but that it's written as satire. And then the second half of the book is basically a halachic argument. And so what I want to do is look at his arguments, look at the sources he quotes, and then look at what he's responding to in Eila Divrei Bris, and sort of ask the question of what's the machloket, what's the argument? They're each bringing proofs for their own, they're each arguing their own side. So we talked about the Gemara that says Eila Namron b'chalashon, that there are things you can say in any language. Shema, Tefillah, Brachos, Berachos Hamazon. You can pray in the vernacular, right? That's one of the big questions here. Is one of the things, right? This is the fight over the temple that they're erecting, and it is that. I mean, it's the temple's being built, and they already have a method of prayer because they've already been functioning for 10 years in Westphalia and Berlin. And the main issues, again, seem to be prayer in the common language, in the language that's spoken, I guess, in German, and the use of the organ. Those seem to be the main issues that are at play in 1819. Obviously, it changes over time, and reform becomes something very different. But the beginnings of reform are very much, about halachic arguments and about, I think, trying to, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt, but trying to say, this is what Jews relate to. Having an organ is where we're at. Like that's the way we serve God, So here, for instance, he quotes the Rambam. So let's look at the Rambam. So here's the Rambam. It's Hilchos Brachos, Parak 1, Mishnah, Halacha 6. It says, V'chol habrachos kulan ne'emarin b'chol lashon. The Rambam does say, he first says that the nusach of all the brachas, the form of the brachas, is from all the way back from Ezra. The ein roy l'shanotam. You should not change them. V'lo l'hosef alachsmem l'gormem. You shouldn't take away from them, add to them. If you change the matbeya means a coin. If you change the form of the blessing, you're mistaken. If it doesn't have God's name and God's sovereignty, that's not a bracha. And it has to be a bracha that either is a very short bracha, if it's a longer bracha, it has to begin with a bracha and end with a bracha, or be next to another bracha. And then he says, brachos, and all the blessings, kula nemron b'cholasham. Now the Rambam, after saying, don't change, now this all comes from the Gemara, don't change, the format. He says the blessings can be said in any language. As long as you're doing it in the format that the rabbis decreed. If you change the format, since you already said the bracha, right? The question is, let's say that you change the format. You say, for instance, the Gemara has an example of this. There was a certain shepherd who used to bench, and he would just say, Brich Rachmana, Malka de Alma, Mari de Haipita. It would say, blessed is the merciful one, the master of the universe, the master of this bread, of this pita. And that was what this certain shepherd would say. And the Gemara says, you are Yotze. So the Rambam says, you have fulfilled your mitzvah of making the bracha. Now, so the Rambam says here that you shouldn't change it, but if you did change the format of the bracha, hold the hisker azkara. Since you already said it, you said it. And since you mentioned malchut, you have to mention God's sovereignty. If you didn't mention God's sovereignty or God's name, you have to say the bracha again. But if you did, even though you changed the format, then in a bracha filo balashon chol yatsa. and you mentioned God's sovereignty, and you mentioned what the bracha is about. So even if you did it in a foreign language, you still have fulfilled your mitzvah. Okay. Here's the Kesef Mishnah, which he's going to quote. So I'll look at that. It says, all the blessings could be said in any language. So he says this also comes from the shepherd in the Gemara in Brachos. Minimin raya kach rifta. He would eat, and then he would say, Baruch Rachmana Mare the High Pita. Blessed is the merciful one, the master of the bread. Oh, interesting. So there's a machlokin in the Gemara whether he said Malchut Alma, whether he said master of the universe, right? Because you have to mention Malchut, the Rambam had said. You have to mention God's sovereignty. So the question, so the Gemara first says, well, okay, he said, blessed is the merciful one, who's the master of the bread, but he didn't say Malchut. He said merciful one, which is one of God's names, but he didn't say Malchut. And so then the Gemara says, no, he did. He said Malchut Alma. Amravi Yatzi de Bracha Rishona. So you've fulfilled your mitzvah of saying the bracha before. Avogadam Balashon Chol. So what the Kesef Mishnah says about the Rambam, what do we learn from that Gemara? That even though you said it in a foreign language, here he's saying it in Aramaic, Tanina, that's enough. And there are other ones that can, before the fact, be said in any language. The portion of the Sota, which is when the Sota is brought into the temple, the grace after meals. And the Gemara has to mention that Rabbanan Balashon HaKodesh, Avo Lo Amar Balashon Chol. Now, you might think that if you said it in Hebrew, but you didn't use the format of the rabbis, that's okay. So I would have said that you don't fulfill your obligation, but the Kesef Mishnah says you do. In other words, if it's in Hebrew, but it's in it's a different format, that's okay, like the shepherd did. But I guess it has to have God's name, it has to have sovereignty, it has to be about the thing you're doing the bracha. Or if it's another language, but it's the right format, that's okay. And he says, this is why the Rambam says it twice. Right? He says that they could be said in any language. And then at the end, he says, even if you said it in a foreign language, not Hebrew, you're Yotze. Why does he say it? Why does he go back and say, even if you said it in a foreign language? The Kesef Mishnah says, even though you have both issues, that you didn't say it in the format of the rabbis, and you didn't say it in Hebrew, you need usually either one. But let's say you didn't. Let's say you said it like that shepherd in the Gemara. And it's you for your blessing either on the bread, or it's really in the Gemara there. It seems after the bread. You say, "Blessed is the merciful one, the master of the bread." Are you Yotze or not? So the Kesef Mishnah is arguing that the Rambam repeats it even in a foreign language to tell you that even if you did it not in Hebrew, even if you did it with the wrong format, as long as it's about the thing it's about, and as long as you mention God's name and God's sovereignty, you're Yotze, you fulfilled your obligation. Okay. And then he says, upon that which the rabbis say, that which the Rambam says in Shinat Matbeya Yatza, that if you changed the structure of the blessing, even though you're not supposed to, but if you did change the structure of blessing, as long as you mentioned God's sovereignty and what the blessing's about, you fulfilled your obligation. You shouldn't do it, but you fulfilled your obligation. You don't have to make another bracha. So he says, so actually he says, well, we see in the laws of Shema, that if you don't say it like the Shema, you don't fulfill your obligation. Actually, so he says over there, it's really talking about the blessings before and after the Shema. That you didn't have the right ending for the blessing. Lo patach b'baruch, you didn't begin the blessing with baruch. Where they said you should have a blessing at the end, you didn't have one. No lift up. So over there, it's talking about where you're missing a bracha. Over here, it's just saying you changed the format. V'lo amar oto lashon mamish. You didn't say exactly the format of the blessing. You said the content of the blessing, but you did it in a different format. Loshina lo b'pticha, but as long as you didn't, so then you would still be yotze. I mean, he says as long as you have the right amount of brachas, as long as you have them where they're supposed to be. Okay. So now we'll go to, that's what this is going to be based on. So now we'll go to what he says. So he says, the Rambam, the laws of blessings, that's the one we just read. So he quotes the Rambam that all blessings can be said in any language. As long as you did it in the way that the rabbis decreed. What does that mean? That it's in the matbeya habracha, it's in the format of the bracha. If you change the format of the bracha, hov hisker azkara. The Rambam had said you should not do it, but if you did it, you fulfilled the mitzvah. Umalchut, and you have to have God's sovereignty in there. Ve'inyan habracha, and you have to have what the blessing is about. Afilu b'lashon chol yatsa. And the Rambam says at the end of that, even in a foreign language, you have fulfilled your obligation. And Kesef Mishnah writes, Zehu shechazar rabbeinu v'kafal, that which the Rambam says it twice, and he goes back and he says, even in a foreign language, you fulfilled your obligation, even though he already said that it could be in a language. Meaning to say that even though you have both issues, the blessing is not as the rabbi said, and it's not in Hebrew, still you're yotzi, fulfilled your mitzvah. Okay. Now he has a little star here, and he tells you what he's arguing against. So he says here he's arguing against, and he does it polemically. He says, he's arguing about against a rabbi named Mordechai in the book Eile Divrei Abrit, who said, let's go to this one. Here he's arguing, where he quotes the Kesef Mishnah, he's arguing against the rabbi named Moshe. And the star here says, Mi Moshe, Viad Moshe lo kam Moshe. From Moses to Moses, there was no one like Moses. Now, usually that's said about the Rambam, but who's he saying it about? Well, he's saying it about a certain rabbi who's writing in Eile Divrei Habrit, what he calls Diba, which means Lashon Hara, but it's Divrei Habrit, Daf Ayin Gimel, page 63, and we'll go and look at that in a second. And that rabbi is named Moshe, and indeed that rabbi is named Moshe. Hu harav Tekila Anuya. He is the rabbi of Anuya. Elav Nigalu Kol Ta'alumot, and he says, right, he's writing in such a sarcastic way. It's really shocking. He says, to him is revealed all the hidden things. V'chol satam lo amamuhu. And nothing is hidden to him. Right? In other words, he's saying that rabbi who I'm writing against right now is named Moshe, and he says about him, he's basically saying he thinks that he's as great as Moses, and that everything is revealed to him. And he writes for the glory of the Torah, he says, and this is his language. You shouldn't make any blessing except in the holy language. Lanu. And God forbid for us to change it. It's an abomination. But God forbid, that we should change the format of the blessing. Okay, so what's he referring to? So it's this. Here's page Ayin Gimel, and here's the rabbi. This is a book. This is the book by the Hamburg Bezdin. It's a compendium of letters against the reform. Harav Agona Mefursam Shevach Marina Rav Moshe Tuvia Nero, the rabbi of Unya V'Hamedina. I'm not sure yet. So I have to look it up. Somewhere in Hungary, I think. So page Ayin Gimel is here, and here's what he writes. Right, he says, let's go back a paragraph. L'chora, back a couple paragraphs to the context. He says, he says, what's the difference between an individual praying and a congregation? Because we know that when it comes to an individual could pray in any language. He says, why should there be a difference between an individual and a community? He's argued basically that a community needs to pray in Hebrew. And an individual, I think, could pray if they need to in another language. So what's different? There's a Gemara in Tanit that says, "Remember, Lezer ain't tefillah shalom mishmaid ela im kain mesin nafshe b'kapo shemen asila veno al papayim." Person's prayer is not heard unless they put their soul in their hands. So the Gemara there is discussing, that if you're with a congregation, even if your prayer is not perfect, it's still accepted. But if you're an individual, you need your prayer to be on a higher level. Even if there's not the right kavanah, as long as it's in a congregational setting, you're yotze, you fulfilled your obligation, and it'll be heard. As far as Rabbanei Tzarfat, according to the rabbis of France, Sheikha Rabbeinu Yonah, Shehevi Rabbeinu Yonah, Abed Yosef, Simon Kofal, Kishiachim Mispal, Tefillah Ba'atzmish, Mispal, Matzivar, Kumot Tefillah B'tzivar, that's if you're praying at the same time as the congregation. It's like praying with the congregation. Valkane, Lomar, Batam, Asfara, Kolbo. So the question is, can you distinguish between an individual and a congregation? Then he says, the languages of nations change over time. Like we see that now they speak Germany here, they speak Hungarian there. But the language of Hebrew, he says, has not changed. He's saying that German has changed over time. Other languages have changed over time, but he's arguing here that Hebrew does not change over time. Niftal v'ikesh lo yachlif. In other words, there's no Hebrew stays the same. It's based on one book. V'lo yamir kihu lefi darkan iglos lanu, and it's been revealed to us. Umelvad kol advar moela lashon mesugal, and therefore the best language to pray in is Hebrew. Choltev v'tera mora gam yora lesodas nefos, and every letter and every word is a reference to something spiritually big. Like a ladder that reaches to heaven. Right? Of course, it's better to pray in Hebrew. That's what he's saying. And that's the custom of the Jewish people to pray in Hebrew. You shouldn't say any blessing except in Hebrew. God forbid for us to change it. It's a desecration, abomination for us. Whether weekday or on Shabbos. Now, let's say if somebody who's ignorant of Hebrew and they want to know what they're saying. So he says, make a translation in the siddur. Write a siddur in Hebrew and have the translation in German. And that way the person will have more kavanah. They won't just say it, they'll know what it means. As if they would pray in German, we shouldn't change the language of the prayer. Okay. Now, remember the Rambam's language, right? The Rambam had begun with, you shouldn't change a blessing. It's a little unclear from the Rambam whether lechatchila, before the fact, you could do it in any language. That is true. Now let's go back to what he says, right? He says, Almash Kotav Rabbeinu, that which he's quoting here the Kesef Mishnah, that which the Rambam said that if you change the phrasing of the blessing, he's quoting the Kesef Mishnah that we just read. That the Kesef Mishnah had said that the Rambam repeats it again to tell you that if you said the blessing in a whole nother format and a different language, that you fulfilled your obligation. And then he says, and the rabbis in in the book of Eli Divrei Abrit, they said, know that you can't change the format. Now, if you think about it, and that's a good question. Does the Rambam distinguish between blessing said communally and individual's blessing? I don't think the Rambam himself does. But right, what are they arguing about? In other words, it's true that you can argue that if you said it in another language, if you said it in a different format, are you Yotze? You fulfilled your obligation, right? So that's what he's quoting. That's what he's saying. He's saying, how can the rabbis of the Hamburg Beis Din say it's an abomination to pray in another language or with another format? The Rambam himself says that you fulfilled your obligation, right? So in a way, like when you step back, what you realize is, of course, you can find these, you can make these arguments, right? The idea that it's an abomination, the Gemara doesn't say it's an abomination. They add that in. What he's saying, it's true. The Rambam says that after the fact, you fulfilled your obligation, but if you step back, what you realize is that they're arguing, but they're talking about different things. Right? In other words, of course, what the Hamburg Beis Din is looking at is, here's a sea change in Jewish prayer, writ large. Should we change Jewish prayer? Should the communal format of Jewish prayer be in a different language with a different format? And so they're saying, of course not. Now obviously in the Reformed temple, so he's pointing out that in the temple itself, this is communal prayer. It's no question about it. And what he's saying is, if you look at the Rambam, it says that if you said it in a different language, you fulfilled your obligation, right? So in a way, like they're talking about different things. Of course, you could argue that, but the question of should you change the Jewish people's format of prayer, right? You could see where the Hamburg Beis Din is coming from. They're saying, they're terrified. It's not that you can't find a way to fulfill your obligation. It's not that you haven't fulfilled your obligation necessarily if you did it. Now, maybe there's a distinction between the communal and the private. That's true. But, and it's true. The Rambam doesn't, I don't think, specifically make that distinction. But in a way, they're just talking about different things. One is talking about, a much bigger question and a fear. And I think that's legitimate, and he's saying, as long as there's some ground for it, why not do it? Right? Probably in his mind, that's what's going to save the Jewish people, right? In the mind of the Hamburg Beis Din, it's just the opposite that's going to save the Jewish people, right? It's all perspective in a way. I'm taking him as a good actor. I mean, I'm assuming that he's not, just trying to play a game in order to, make an excuse for the Enlightenment. I think he knows enough that he's, has legitimate intent that he thinks this is going to be good for the Jews. I'm assuming everybody thinks what they're doing is good for the Jews. I assume the Reform thought that also. But it's not unfamiliar to us. I mean, the question of this precisely, or the organ, is unfamiliar to us. But the question of, if something's permitted, should you do it because we think it's going to be better for the Jews? That's not an unfamiliar question to us. I mean, it's throughout the conservative movement, and you can certainly argue this is the nature of. One question is sort of what's legit, what's original, what's legitimate, and the other question is, even if it's not original, what changes are justified in order to help the Jews at this moment, the way we see it. All right, so we'll look at a little bit more. I think it's a good way to look at the original source, and then to find out what he's arguing against, and try and see both sides.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good day.
Thank you.